Marcus Williams had owned the 4-acre plot of land on Magnolia Street for over 15 years. The property had been in his family for 3 generations, passed down from his grandfather who had worked tirelessly as a railroad mechanic to purchase it back in 1952. The land sat in what was now one of the most desirable neighborhoods in suburban Atlanta, surrounded by million-dollar homes and perfectly manicured lawns. Marcus, a 58-year-old electrician, had always planned to build his dream home on the property someday. Life had gotten in the way, though. First, there was his divorce, which drained his savings. Then his mother's medical bills when she battled cancer for 3 years. Each time he thought about starting construction, another financial crisis would emerge. So the land sat partially wooded, with an old mobile home where Marcus sometimes stayed on weekends when he needed to escape the noise of city life. The Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association had been eyeing Marcus's property for years. Led by their ambitious president, Victoria Ashford, the HOA represented some of the wealthiest residents in the county. Victoria, a 45-year-old real estate developer with platinum blonde hair and a reputation for getting what she wanted, had moved to the neighborhood 5 years earlier. She lived in a sprawling 8,000-square-foot mansion with her investment banker husband and 2 teenage children. Victoria had a vision for the neighborhood that didn't include Marcus's modest mobile home and undeveloped land. She believed his property was an eyesore that brought down property values for everyone else. During HOA meetings, she would often make pointed comments about certain properties that didn't meet the community's standards. Other residents knew exactly what she meant. The trouble began when Marcus received his first official notice from the HOA. The letter, printed on expensive letterhead and signed by Victoria herself, informed him that his property was in violation of several community standards. According to the HOA, his mobile home was not a permitted dwelling type. His grass was too long, and he had failed to submit architectural plans for approval as required by the community covenants. Marcus was confused. He had never been a member of the HOA. When he purchased the land in 2008, it was outside the boundaries of any homeowners association. He had specifically chosen the property because he wanted the freedom to develop it as he saw fit, without interference from busybody neighbors. He called the HOA office and explained this to the secretary, a nervous woman named Janet who seemed apologetic but insisted that all properties in the area were now subject to HOA oversight. "That's impossible," Marcus told Janet during their phone conversation. "I never signed any HOA agreement. I never agreed to be bound by your rules. You can't just declare that my property is part of your association." Janet promised to look into it and get back to him. She never called back. The second notice arrived 2 weeks later, this time via certified mail. The tone was more aggressive. Victoria had personally signed this one too, and she had included a list of fines that would be assessed if Marcus didn't bring his property into compliance within 30 days. The fines totaled $2,500 and would increase by $100 per day until the violations were corrected. Marcus decided to attend the next HOA meeting to address the issue in person. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beautiful building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that the HOA had built using dues collected from members. When Marcus arrived, he immediately felt out of place. He had come straight from work and was wearing his electrician's uniform, while everyone else was dressed in expensive casual wear. Victoria was holding court at the front of the room, discussing the agenda with other board members. When she noticed Marcus, her expression shifted slightly. She didn't acknowledge him directly, but he could tell she was aware of his presence. When the time came for community input, Marcus stood up and introduced himself. He explained that he had received notices claiming his property was subject to HOA oversight, but that he had never joined the association and didn't believe they had any authority over his land. Victoria listened with a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. When Marcus finished speaking, she consulted a thick folder of documents. "Mr. Williams," she said in a patronizing tone that made several other residents shift uncomfortably in their seats. "I understand your confusion, but I'm afraid you're mistaken. Your property is indeed subject to our covenants. When the neighborhood was incorporated into our HOA boundaries last year, all properties within those boundaries became subject to our oversight, regardless of when they were purchased." Marcus felt his blood pressure rising. "That's not how property law works," he said, trying to keep his voice level. You can't just unilaterally decide that someone's property is part of your association. There has to be a legal process. Property owners have to consent. Victoria's smile became even more condescending. Mr. Williams, I'm a licensed real estate professional with over 20 years of experience. I think I understand property law quite well. The incorporation was done through proper legal channels. If you'd like to dispute it, you're certainly welcome to hire an attorney, though I should warn you that legal fees can be quite expensive. The room was silent. Marcus looked around at the other residents, hoping to see some support or at least sympathy in their faces. Instead, he saw people avoiding eye contact, studying their phones, or finding sudden interest in the meeting agenda. Marcus left the meeting feeling frustrated and defeated. He couldn't afford to hire a lawyer, and Victoria knew it. She was counting on his inability to fight back legally, but Marcus wasn't the type of man to give up easily. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes you have to be patient and strategic when dealing with bullies. That night, Marcus sat in his mobile home and made a plan. He would research the HOA's claims thoroughly. He would document everything, and he would find a way to protect his family's land from Victoria Ashford's schemes, even if it took years. What Marcus didn't know was that Victoria had much bigger plans for his property than simply forcing him to comply with HOA rules. She had been studying the neighborhood's development potential for months, and his 4 acres represented the perfect location for her next major project. She had already begun the preliminary work to make his land her own, using methods that would have shocked even the other HOA members if they had known what she was planning. Victoria Ashford wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not by someone she considered beneath her social standing. After Marcus's appearance at the HOA meeting, she accelerated her timeline. She had been working on acquiring his property for months, but now she felt a sense of urgency. The last thing she needed was for Marcus to start asking too many questions, or, worse, to actually hire a lawyer who might uncover what she was really up to. The next morning, Victoria called her attorney, James Morrison, a sharp-dressed man in his early 50s who specialized in real estate law and had helped her navigate several questionable deals in the past. Morrison's office was located in a gleaming downtown tower, and his hourly rate was more than Marcus made in a week. James, we need to move faster on the Williams property, Victoria said during their meeting. The owner is starting to ask uncomfortable questions about the HOA's authority. Morrison leaned back in his leather chair and studied the file Victoria had brought. You're playing with fire here, Victoria. What you're proposing is legally questionable at best. If this Marcus Williams is smart enough to get a real lawyer involved, he can't afford a real lawyer. Victoria interrupted. I've done my research. He's been struggling financially for years. His credit report shows medical debt, a recent divorce, and he's been late on his property taxes twice in the past 5 years. Morrison nodded slowly. Still, forcing someone into an HOA without their consent is tricky business. The incorporation documents you filed with the county are technically valid, but they won't hold up to serious legal scrutiny. We're counting on Williams not having the resources to fight back. Victoria's plan was more sophisticated than Marcus realized. She had spent months laying the groundwork, using her connections in local government and her knowledge of real estate law to create a web of legal documents that appeared legitimate on the surface but contained numerous irregularities that would benefit her in the long run. That the first step had been the neighborhood incorporation she had mentioned to Marcus. Victoria had filed paperwork with the county claiming that several property owners in the area had petitioned to be included in the HOA's boundaries. The signatures on the petition were real, but they belonged to her friends and business associates who didn't actually own property in the area. The county clerk, overwhelmed with paperwork and understaffed, had approved the incorporation without conducting a thorough verification of the signatures. The second step was more devious. Victoria had been quietly purchasing small parcels of land around Marcus's property, using shell companies. These purchases weren't intended to make money immediately, but rather to establish a pattern of ownership that would support her ultimate goal. She now owned or controlled nearly 60% of the land within a half-mile radius of Marcus's property, but Victoria's masterstroke was still to come. She had been working with a corrupt county assessor named Robert Chen, who owed her several favors from previous real estate deals. Chen had agreed to accidentally misfile Marcus's property tax payments, making it appear as though Marcus had been delinquent for longer than he actually had been. Under Georgia law, properties with delinquent taxes could be sold at public auction if the back taxes weren't paid within a certain time frame. Victoria's plan was to manipulate this process, ensuring that Marcus would lose his property for a fraction of its actual value, which she could then purchase through one of her shell companies. Meanwhile, Marcus was conducting his own investigation. He had taken vacation days from his electrical work to spend time at the county courthouse, poring over public records and trying to understand how his property had supposedly become subject to HOA oversight. What he found disturbed him. The incorporation documents showed signatures from property owners he had never heard of, claiming addresses that didn't exist or belonged to empty lots. The more he dug, the more irregularities he found. Marcus might not have had a college education, but he was intelligent and methodical. His work as an electrician had taught him to trace problems back to their source, and he applied the same systematic approach to investigating Victoria's claims. Marcus also discovered something interesting about Victoria's own property. According to county records, she had purchased her mansion for significantly less than its assessed value, and the previous owner had been an elderly widow who had died shortly after the sale. The transaction had been handled by James Morrison, the same attorney who now represented the HOA. One evening, while reviewing documents in his mobile home, Marcus's phone rang. The caller identified himself as Eugene Peterson, an elderly man who lived 2 streets over from Marcus's property. "Mr. Williams," Eugene said in a shaky voice, "I heard about your troubles with the HOA. I think you should know that I never signed any petition to include your property in their boundaries." Marcus's heart rate increased. "Mr. Peterson, are you saying your signature was forged?" "I'm saying I never signed anything like that. But according to these papers I'm looking at, my signature is there clear as day. Someone's been playing games, and I don't like it one bit." Eugene explained that he had been contacted by other neighbors who were equally confused about their alleged support for expanding the HOA's boundaries. A pattern was emerging that confirmed Marcus's suspicions about the legitimacy of Victoria's incorporation documents. Armed with this new information, Marcus decided to take a different approach. Instead of trying to hire an expensive lawyer he couldn't afford, he contacted the local newspaper. The reporter who answered his call was Sarah Chen, a young investigative journalist who had been looking for a story about corruption in local government. Sarah was immediately interested in Marcus's story. She had been tracking several questionable real estate deals in the county and had suspected that someone was manipulating the system for personal gain. Marcus's case might be the key to exposing a much larger pattern of corruption. "Mr. Williams," Sarah said during their first meeting at a coffee shop near the courthouse, "what you're describing isn't just about your property. If someone is forging signatures to manipulate HOA boundaries, they're potentially defrauding multiple property owners. This could be a significant story." While Marcus was building his case with Sarah's help, Victoria was putting the final pieces of her plan into motion. She had convinced the HOA board to approve a special assessment of $50,000 per property owner to fund neighborhood improvements. The improvements were vaguely defined and would primarily benefit Victoria's development plans. Marcus received notice of the special assessment in the mail on a Friday afternoon. The letter demanded payment within 30 days and threatened legal action if he failed to comply. The amount was more than Marcus's annual salary. That weekend, Marcus sat on his land and looked out over the property his grandfather had worked so hard to purchase. He thought about the stories his grandfather had told him about facing discrimination and prejudice, about the importance of standing up for what was right even when the odds seemed impossible. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. Instead of trying to fight Victoria on her terms, he would let her think she was winning. He would document every illegal action she took, gather evidence of every forged signature and manipulated document, and then he would spring his trap when she least expected it. Victoria, confident that victory was within her grasp, began making plans for the luxury villa she would build on Marcus's land once she acquired it. She had no idea that her actions were being carefully documented by someone who understood that patience and persistence could overcome even the most sophisticated schemes. Victoria's confidence grew with each passing week. The special assessment had gone unchallenged by Marcus, and she interpreted his silence as defeat. What she didn't know was that Marcus was working with Sarah Chen and a team of volunteers to meticulously document every aspect of Victoria's scheme. They had uncovered evidence of forged signatures, manipulated tax records, and a web of shell companies that all traced back to Victoria and her associates. 3 months after the special assessment notice, Victoria received the news she had been waiting for. Robert Chen, the corrupt county assessor, called to inform her that Marcus's property was officially delinquent on both property taxes and HOA assessments. The total amount owed, including penalties and interest, had grown to over $75,000. Under county law, the property could now be put up for auction. Victoria wasted no time. She had one of her shell companies, Magnolia Development LLC, submit the winning bid at the tax auction. The bid was for $80,000, which covered the back taxes and fees but was less than 5% of the property's actual market value. Marcus didn't appear at the auction, which Victoria took as further evidence that he had given up. What Victoria didn't realize was that Marcus had made a strategic decision not to contest the auction. Working with Sarah Chen and a pro bono lawyer who had taken interest in the case, Marcus had discovered that the entire auction was based on fraudulent documents. Rather than trying to stop the auction and potentially alerting Victoria to his investigation, Marcus decided to let the fraud continue. Every illegal action Victoria took would strengthen his case when he eventually sought justice. The legal transfer of the property to Magnolia Development LLC was completed within weeks. Victoria now officially owned the 4 acres that had been in Marcus's family for 3 generations. She immediately began planning the most ambitious construction project of her career, a $6 million luxury villa that would serve as both her new residence and a showcase for her development company. Victoria hired Atlanta's most prestigious architectural firm to design the villa. The plans called for a 15,000 square foot mansion with 8 bedrooms, 10 bathrooms, a wine cellar, a home theater, an indoor swimming pool, and a 4-car garage. The property would also feature tennis courts, a guest house, and elaborate landscaping that would require removing most of the existing trees on the land. Construction began in early spring. Victoria spared no expense, hiring only the most skilled craftsmen and using the finest materials. Italian marble was imported for the floors. Custom millwork was handcrafted by artisans from North Carolina, and the kitchen featured appliances that cost more than many people's cars. Marcus watched the construction from a distance, his heart breaking as he saw the land his grandfather had loved being transformed beyond recognition. The old oak tree where he had played as a child was cut down to make room for the tennis court. The small creek that had run through the property was rerouted to accommodate the swimming pool. Every day of construction felt like another assault on his family's legacy. But Marcus forced himself to document everything. Working with Sarah Chen, he photographed the construction progress, tracked the contractors involved, and monitored the building permits that Victoria had obtained. They discovered that several of the permits had been fast-tracked through the approval process, bypassing normal safety and environmental reviews. During this time, Marcus had to find a new place to live. The mobile home had been demolished in the first week of construction. He moved into a small apartment across town, paying rent with money he had saved by working extra shifts and taking on weekend electrical jobs. The apartment was a far cry from the land where he had planned to build his dream home, but he reminded himself that this was temporary. Victoria, meanwhile, was in her element. She threw elaborate parties for potential clients at the construction site, showcasing the villa's progress and her company's capabilities. Local society magazines featured articles about the project, praising Victoria's vision and taste. She was profiled in Atlanta Business Journal as one of the city's most innovative developers. "This project represents the future of luxury living in Atlanta," Victoria told the magazine reporter during a tour of the construction site. "We're creating something truly special here, a home that combines classical elegance with modern amenities." The reporter asked about the property's history, and Victoria's response revealed her callous attitude toward Marcus and his family. "The land was previously undeveloped," she said dismissively. "There was an old mobile home that was bringing down property values for the entire neighborhood. We've transformed an eyesore into something beautiful that the whole community can be proud of." When Sarah Chen read this interview, she felt a surge of anger on Marcus's behalf. She had been working on her investigative story for months, gathering evidence and interviewing sources. The story was nearly complete, but she was waiting for the right moment to publish it for maximum impact. As construction progressed through the summer, Victoria made several decisions that would later prove to be crucial mistakes. First, she decided to host a grand opening party for the villa before it was completely finished. She wanted to generate buzz for her development company and attract new wealthy clients to the neighborhood. Second, she became increasingly careless about covering her tracks. Success had made her overconfident, and she stopped taking the precautions that had helped her avoid detection in earlier schemes. She began using her personal email account for business communications that should have remained confidential, and she made phone calls about sensitive matters from her office where other people could overhear. Marcus and Sarah had anticipated this moment. They knew that Victoria's pride and arrogance would eventually lead her to make mistakes that would expose her crimes. They had been patient, gathering evidence and building their case methodically. The grand opening party was scheduled for a Saturday evening in late September. Victoria sent engraved invitations to over 200 people, including local politicians, business leaders, and potential clients. The invitation described the event as a celebration of visionary development and promised tours of the completed portions of the villa. Marcus received an invitation, which surprised him until he realized that Victoria probably sent it as a final insult, a way of rubbing his nose in her victory. She wanted him to see what she had built on his family's land, to witness the destruction of his heritage and his dreams. But Victoria had badly miscalculated. The invitation wasn't an insult to Marcus. It was an opportunity. He had been waiting for months for the right moment to reveal Victoria's crimes to the world. The grand opening party, with its gathering of influential people and media attention, would provide the perfect stage for his counterattack. Marcus RSVP'd that he would attend, using the formal response card that Victoria had included with the invitation. When Victoria's assistant informed her that Marcus Williams had accepted the invitation, Victoria laughed. "Perfect," she said. "Let him come and see what real success looks like. Maybe it will teach him not to challenge people who are out of his league." Victoria had no idea that Marcus had spent months planning for this moment, that he had evidence of every crime she had committed, and that her moment of triumph was about to become her downfall. The villa that she had built through fraud and corruption would soon become the symbol of her disgrace, and the land that she had stolen would be returned to its rightful owner. The week before Victoria's grand opening party, Marcus and Sarah Chen put their plan into motion. They had spent over a year gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building an airtight case against Victoria and her co-conspirators. Now it was time to spring their carefully orchestrated trap. Sarah's newspaper article was scheduled to publish online at exactly 6 p.m. on the day of the party, just as guests would be arriving at the villa. The timing was crucial. Sarah wanted the story to break while Victoria was surrounded by the city's elite, people whose opinions and business relationships were crucial to her success. The article, titled "The Stolen Dream: How an HOA President Built Her Empire on Fraud," was accompanied by a detailed timeline of Victoria's crimes and dozens of supporting documents. Sarah had worked with a team of editors and fact-checkers to ensure that every claim was backed by solid evidence. Meanwhile, Marcus had been working with FBI agent Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in real estate fraud cases. Agent Walsh had taken interest in the case after Sarah Chen contacted the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. The evidence that Marcus and Sarah had gathered was compelling enough to warrant a federal investigation. "Mr. Williams," Agent Walsh had told Marcus during one of their meetings, "what Ms. Ashford has done goes far beyond simple property theft. She's committed mail fraud, wire fraud, conspiracy, and potentially tax evasion. This is a RICO case waiting to happen." The FBI had been conducting its own investigation for 3 months, using the evidence provided by Marcus and Sarah as a starting point. They had uncovered additional crimes, including a pattern of similar fraudulent property acquisitions in other counties. Victoria wasn't just a local criminal. She was part of a larger network of developers who were systematically stealing land from vulnerable property owners. On the morning of the grand opening party, Victoria woke up feeling triumphant. The villa was a masterpiece, and she was confident that the evening would establish her as Atlanta's premier luxury developer. She had no idea that federal agents were already in position around the property, waiting for the signal to move in. Victoria spent the day supervising final preparations for the party. Caterers arranged elaborate food displays in the villa's grand dining room. Bartenders set up stations throughout the house and on the outdoor terraces. A string quartet rehearsed in the main foyer, their music echoing through the marble halls. As afternoon turned to evening, guests began arriving. Atlanta's social elite came dressed in their finest attire, eager to see the villa that had been generating buzz for months. Local politicians mingled with business leaders and society figures. Everyone wanted to be seen at Victoria's party. Marcus arrived at 6:30 p.m., dressed in his best suit. He had borrowed the outfit from his brother, knowing that his appearance at the party would be crucial to the plan's success. As he walked up the curved driveway toward the villa's front entrance, his emotions threatened to overwhelm him. This was his grandfather's land, the place where his family had planned to build their future, and now it was covered by an obscene monument to Victoria's greed. Victoria spotted Marcus as soon as he entered the foyer. She was standing near the grand staircase holding a glass of champagne and entertaining a group of potential investors. When she saw Marcus, her smile became predatory. "Mr. Williams," she called out loudly enough for nearby guests to hear, "how wonderful that you could join us this evening. I hope you're enjoying seeing what this property has become." Marcus nodded politely. "It's quite impressive, Ms. Ashford. You've certainly spared no expense." Victoria's friends and business associates looked between them with curiosity, sensing tension but not understanding its source. Victoria, emboldened by the attention and confident in her victory, decided to twist the knife deeper. "You know," she announced to the gathered group, "Mr. Williams used to own this land. He had it for years but never did anything with it.
Can you imagine?
All this potential wasted." She gestured grandly at the opulent surroundings. Sometimes it takes vision and resources to unlock a property's true value. At exactly 7 p.m., while Victoria was giving a formal tour to a group of investors, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah Chen. "The story is live. FBI is moving in now." Marcus looked around the room, noting the locations of the agents he had been told would be present. Agent Walsh was posing as a caterer, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. 2 other agents were dressed as guests, blending in perfectly with the well-heeled crowd. The first sign that something was wrong came when Victoria's assistant, Janet, rushed up to her with a panicked expression. She whispered something in Victoria's ear that made the color drain from her face. Victoria excused herself from the tour group and hurried toward her temporary office, which had been set up in one of the villa's bedrooms. Within minutes, guests began receiving news alerts on their phones. Those who opened the alerts found themselves reading Sarah Chen's explosive article about Victoria's crimes. The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people read the shocking details. Several guests began quietly moving toward the exits. Victoria emerged from her office looking frantic. She had read the article and understood that her world was about to collapse. She spotted Marcus across the room and their eyes met. For the first time, Marcus saw fear in her expression instead of arrogance. Agent Walsh chose that moment to reveal herself. She approached Victoria with her FBI credentials displayed and spoke in a voice that carried across the now quiet room. "Victoria Ashford, you're under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, mail fraud, and theft of property. You have the right to remain silent." The remaining party guests watched in stunned silence as Victoria was handcuffed in the middle of her own grand opening party. The string quartet had stopped playing, and the only sounds were the clicking of cell phone cameras as guests documented Victoria's downfall. Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness as he watched Victoria being led away. He was glad that justice was finally being served, but he took no pleasure in seeing another human being's life destroyed. Even someone who had tried to destroy his James Morrison. Victoria's attorney was arrested at his downtown office an hour later. Robert Chen, the corrupt county assessor, was taken into custody at his home. The FBI had coordinated simultaneous arrests to prevent any of the conspirators from warning the others or destroying evidence. The villa, which Victoria had intended as a symbol of her success, became instead a symbol of her crimes. The property was immediately seized by federal authorities as evidence in the case. Yellow crime scene tape stretched across the entrance where, just hours earlier, Atlanta's elite had gathered to celebrate. Marcus stood outside the villa as the last of the party guests departed, and FBI agents continued their investigation inside. Sarah Chen joined him along with Agent Walsh. "How are you feeling, Mr. Williams?" Sarah asked. Marcus looked up at the massive house that had been built on his family's land through fraud and corruption. "I'm grateful that the truth finally came out," he said. "But this isn't really about revenge for me. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to other families." Agent Walsh nodded approvingly. "Your evidence and patience made this case possible. Mr. Williams, without your methodical documentation of Ms. Ashford's crimes, we might never have been able to build such a strong case." As they stood there in the gathering darkness, Marcus began to allow himself to believe that his family's land might actually be returned to him. The legal process would be complex and would take time, but the evidence was overwhelming. Victoria's empire had been built on fraud, and everything she had stolen would eventually be given back to its rightful owners. The grand opening party that was supposed to be Victoria's moment of triumph had become her moment of reckoning. And Marcus Williams, the man she had dismissed as powerless and irrelevant, had orchestrated her downfall with patience, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to justice. The days following Victoria's arrest were a whirlwind of media attention and legal proceedings. Sarah Chen's article had gone viral, generating national coverage about corruption in local government and the vulnerability of property owners to sophisticated fraud schemes. Marcus found himself thrust into the spotlight as the hero of a David versus Goliath story that resonated with people across the country. FBI. Agent Walsh worked quickly to unravel the full extent of Victoria's criminal network. The investigation revealed that Victoria had been running similar schemes in 4 different counties, targeting elderly property owners and families who lacked the resources to fight back legally. In total, she had fraudulently acquired over $15 million worth of real estate, using variations of the same tactics she had employed against Marcus. The evidence against Victoria was overwhelming. Federal prosecutors found detailed records of her various schemes in her office computer and personal files. She had been meticulous about documenting her illegal activities, apparently believing that she was too clever to ever be caught. Her own records became the prosecution's most powerful evidence. Victoria's attorney, James Morrison, faced his own legal troubles. The FBI discovered that he had been an active participant in Victoria's schemes, rather than simply an unwitting accomplice. Morrison had helped create the shell companies used to purchase stolen properties, had filed fraudulent incorporation documents, and had even helped forge signatures on various legal documents. His law license was immediately suspended pending the outcome of his criminal trial. Robert Chen, the corrupt county assessor, cooperated with federal authorities in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony revealed the systematic nature of Victoria's corruption, including bribes paid to other county officials and a network of contacts who helped facilitate her fraudulent property acquisitions. Chen's cooperation led to additional arrests and expanded the scope of the federal investigation. Marcus watched these developments with a mixture of satisfaction and disbelief. For over a year, he had felt powerless against Victoria's schemes. Now the full weight of federal law enforcement was working to undo the damage she had caused and ensure that she faced appropriate consequences for her crimes. The legal process of returning Marcus's property proved to be complex but straightforward. Since Victoria's acquisition of the land had been entirely fraudulent, the federal court ordered that the property be immediately returned to Marcus. However, the villa that Victoria had built created an unusual situation that required careful legal consideration. Federal prosecutors offered Marcus several options. He could have the villa demolished and the land restored to its original condition, with the government covering all costs. Alternatively, he could keep the villa as compensation for the emotional distress and financial losses he had suffered. The villa's value far exceeded any damages Marcus could claim, but prosecutors argued that the extraordinary nature of Victoria's crimes justified extraordinary compensation. Marcus spent several sleepless nights considering his options. The villa was beautiful and valuable, but it represented everything he despised about Victoria's character and methods. Every marble floor and crystal chandelier had been paid for with money stolen from his family's heritage. Living in the house would feel like participating in Victoria's crimes. On the other hand, Marcus recognized the practical benefits of keeping the villa. He could sell it and use the proceeds to help other victims of property fraud, or he could use it to establish a foundation that would provide legal assistance to families facing similar situations. The house that had been built through greed and corruption could become a force for good. After consulting with his family and Sarah Chen, Marcus made his decision. He would keep the villa, but he would transform its purpose entirely. Instead of serving as Victoria's monument to herself, it would become a community center that provided free legal services and education to help property owners protect themselves from fraud. The transformation of the villa into the Williams Community Legal Center took 6 months to complete. Marcus worked with architects and contractors to convert the elaborate residential spaces into offices, meeting rooms, and a law library. The wine cellar became a record storage area. The home theater was converted into a classroom where workshops on property rights and legal protections were held. Marcus also established the Williams Foundation for Property Justice, using proceeds from Victoria's seized assets to fund the center's operations. The foundation provided free legal representation to families facing property fraud and worked to educate communities about their rights. Victoria's trial began 18 months after her arrest. The federal courthouse was packed with media representatives and victims of her various schemes. Marcus attended every day of the trial, sitting in the front row and listening as prosecutors methodically presented evidence of Victoria's crimes. Victoria's defense attorney argued that she had been misguided rather than malicious, claiming that she had genuinely believed her property acquisitions were legal. The argument was undermined by the detailed records Victoria had kept, which clearly showed her awareness that she was committing fraud. Email exchanges between Victoria and her co-conspirators contained explicit discussions of how to avoid detection and what to do if property owners became suspicious. The most damaging evidence came from Victoria's own computer files. Investigators found a spreadsheet titled Acquisition Targets that listed dozens of properties along with detailed information about their owners' financial vulnerabilities. Marcus's property was listed with notes including elderly grandfather died, current owner financially struggling, perfect target for fast acquisition. Marcus felt sick reading these notes, realizing how calculating and cold-blooded Victoria's approach had been. She hadn't stumbled into crime through desperation or poor judgment. She had systematically targeted vulnerable families and destroyed their lives for financial gain. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Victoria was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $18 million to her victims. James Morrison received 8 years, while Robert Chen was sentenced to 3 years for his cooperation with investigators. After the sentencing, Marcus stood outside the courthouse with Sarah Chen and Agent Walsh. The media attention was intense, with reporters from national news outlets wanting to interview the man who had brought down one of the South's most brazen property fraud schemes. "Mr. Williams," one reporter called out, "how does it feel to finally get justice?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Justice isn't just about punishment," he said. "It's about making sure this doesn't happen to other families. That's why we're opening the community center. We want to turn something that was built through crime into something that protects people from becoming victims." Sarah Chen had won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigative reporting on the case, but she gave much of the credit to Marcus's patience and methodical approach to gathering evidence. "Marcus taught me that sometimes the best way to fight corruption is to let it expose itself," she told the gathered reporters. He could have tried to stop Victoria early on, but instead he documented every crime she committed. That patience made it possible to build an unshakable case. Agent Walsh announced that the FBI was using Marcus's case as a model for investigating similar schemes nationwide. The agency had identified patterns of property fraud in dozens of other communities and was working with local law enforcement to protect vulnerable property owners. As the crowd of reporters and supporters began to disperse, Marcus felt a profound sense of closure. His grandfather's land had been returned to his family. Victoria and her conspirators were facing appropriate consequences for their crimes, and the community center would help protect others from similar schemes. But perhaps most importantly, Marcus had proven that ordinary people could stand up to corruption and win, even when the odds seemed impossible. His grandfather had taught him that persistence and moral courage could overcome any obstacle, and that lesson had proven true in ways his grandfather could never have imagined. The villa that Victoria had built as a monument to her own greed had become something far more valuable, a symbol of justice and a beacon of hope for families fighting to protect their heritage. Marcus's patience and determination had transformed a story of theft and corruption into one of redemption and community service. That evening, Marcus stood on the land his grandfather had purchased 70 years earlier, looking up at the stars through the same oak trees his grandfather had planted. The villa behind him was no longer a symbol of his family's loss, but rather a testament to their ultimate victory. Tomorrow, the Williams Community Legal Center would open its doors, and Marcus's long journey from victim to victor would finally be complete. 5 years after Victoria's conviction, the Williams Community Legal Center had become a beacon of hope for families across the Southeast. The center had helped over 300 families protect their property rights and had prevented millions of dollars in fraudulent land acquisitions. Marcus had built something far more valuable than the dream home he had originally planned for his grandfather's land. The transformation of Victoria's villa into a community resource had been so successful that other cities were replicating the model. The main floor of the building housed a law library and consultation rooms where volunteer attorneys provided free legal advice. The second floor contained offices for full-time staff lawyers who handled complex property fraud cases. The former, wine cellar, had been converted into a secure document storage facility where families could safely store their property deeds and other important papers. Marcus had also established an annual conference at the center, bringing together law enforcement officers, attorneys, and community advocates to share information about emerging fraud schemes and develop new strategies for protecting vulnerable property owners. The conference had become one of the most respected gatherings in the field of property rights advocacy. Sarah Chen had left newspaper journalism to write a book about the case, titled Stolen Ground: How One Man's Fight for Justice Exposed a National Crisis. The book became a bestseller and was optioned for a feature film. Sarah donated a portion of her proceeds to the Williams Foundation, ensuring that the center's work could continue expanding. Agent Walsh had been promoted within the FBI and now headed a special task force focused on real estate fraud. The task force had recovered over $200 million in stolen property and had successfully prosecuted dozens of criminals using techniques pioneered during the Victoria Ashford investigation. Victoria herself had not adjusted well to prison life. The woman who had once commanded rooms full of Atlanta's elite now spent her days in a federal correctional facility in Alabama, working in the prison laundry for less than $1 per hour. Her appeals had been unsuccessful, and she faced the reality of serving most of her 12-year sentence. Marcus occasionally received letters from Victoria, but he never opened them. His attorney advised him that responding to Victoria's communications could complicate ongoing civil litigation, but more importantly, Marcus felt no need to engage with someone who had shown no genuine remorse for her crimes. The civil lawsuits against Victoria's various business entities had resulted in additional compensation for her victims. Marcus had received a settlement of $2.5 million, which he immediately donated to the foundation. He preferred to live modestly in his small apartment across town, visiting his grandfather's land daily to oversee the center's operations, but choosing not to live in the villa that represented so much pain and struggle. One of the most rewarding aspects of Marcus's new role was mentoring other property fraud victims who came to the center for help. He had developed a keen ability to recognize the signs of fraud and corruption, and his calm, methodical approach to problem-solving had helped dozens of families save their homes and land. Eugene Peterson, the elderly neighbor who had first alerted Marcus to the forged signatures on Victoria's incorporation documents, had become one of the center's most dedicated volunteers. Despite being in his 80s, Eugene spent 3 days a week at the center, helping to research property records and verify ownership documents for families seeking assistance. "You know, Marcus," Eugene said one afternoon as they reviewed a case involving a family in rural Georgia, "your grandfather would be proud of what you've built here. He always said that land wasn't just about what you could build on it, but about what it could do for your community." Marcus smiled. remembering the stories his grandfather had told about the importance of helping neighbors and standing up for what was right. The center had become exactly the kind of community resource his grandfather would have supported. The most significant development in recent months had been the introduction of federal legislation inspired by Marcus's case. The Property Rights Protection Act, sponsored by senators from both parties, would strengthen penalties for property fraud and provide additional resources for victims of these crimes. Marcus had testified before Congress in support of the legislation, sharing his story with lawmakers and advocating for stronger protections. During his congressional testimony, Marcus had emphasized that property fraud wasn't just about money or legal technicalities. When someone steals your family's land, he told the senators, they're stealing your history, your memories, and your children's future. This kind of crime attacks the very foundation of the American dream, and we need laws that reflect how serious these offenses really are. The legislation had passed the Senate unanimously and was expected to be signed into law by the president within months. Marcus had been invited to attend the signing ceremony, which would take place in the Rose Garden. As Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, he marveled at how different his life had become. 5 years earlier, he had been a struggling electrician facing the loss of his family's land to a sophisticated fraud scheme. Now he was a nationally recognized advocate for property rights, running a thriving legal center and working with federal lawmakers to strengthen protections for vulnerable families. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Marcus had found purpose in his struggle with Victoria, transforming his anger and frustration into positive action that helped others. The center had given him a sense of mission that went far beyond his original dream of building a house on his grandfather's land. On quiet evenings, Marcus would walk the grounds around the center, following the same paths he had explored as a child. The old oak tree his grandfather had planted still stood, now surrounded by a memorial garden honoring families who had lost their land to fraud. Marcus had installed a bench beneath the tree where visitors could sit and reflect. The plaque on the bench bore a quote from Marcus's grandfather. "The land doesn't belong to us. We belong to the land. Our job is to protect it for those who come after us." Victoria's villa, which had once been a monument to greed and corruption, had become something entirely different under Marcus's stewardship. It was now a place where justice was pursued, where victims found help, and where communities came together to protect their most vulnerable members. Marcus often thought about the irony of the situation. Victoria had intended to destroy his family's connection to their land, but her crimes had ultimately strengthened that connection in ways she could never have imagined. The center ensured that Marcus's grandfather's legacy would endure for generations, helping countless families protect their own pieces of the American dream. As the sun set over the memorial garden, Marcus felt a deep sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought him to this moment. The fight for his family's land had been painful and difficult, but it had led to something far more important than personal justice. It had created a lasting institution that would protect other families from experiencing the trauma he had endured. The Williams Community Legal Center stood as proof that patience, persistence, and moral courage could triumph over even the most sophisticated forms of corruption. Victoria Ashford had built her villa through lies and theft, but Marcus Williams had transformed it into something honest and enduring, a beacon of hope for anyone fighting to protect their heritage and their dreams.